is Jewish Spotlight, a weekly television program presented by Chabad Lubavitch of Long Island, featuring various aspects of modern Jewish life and Jewish culture. Now, here is your host, Rabbi Tuvia Teldin.
Shalom. The Arab-Israeli conflict is one which is consuming the time and efforts and the concern of many people, millions and billions of people around the world. However, for us here in the States, our perception of what's going on is based on perhaps a person we know who might live in Israel, maybe someone we know who traveled or who spoke to somebody in Israel. But for the most part, for most of us, 99% of our understanding of what's going on there is based on the press and the media and how they are presenting the conflict itself, which puts a responsibility on the press and the media to a much greater degree to make sure that the case that they're presenting is a case that in fact reflects the true nature of this conflict. However, there have been many organizations over the past years that have made a major effort to expose the fact that the press is not exactly presenting the conflict in the proper light. I don't mean proper light in the sense that the pro-Israeli crew is saying that it's not pro-Israeli enough, and the pro-Arab world is saying it's not pro-Arab world, it's saying that it's not pro-Arab enough. But in the sense that there are actual mistakes in journalistic policy, there are actual things that are being done deliberately or indeliberately, which is something we can discuss, that present the case itself, the situation in Israel, in a false light. And as a result, we, the consumers, are taking this information and are really processing and making decisions of our own on that basis. Well, the next half hour, we're going to hear from two experts in the field who are going to tell us about some of the mistakes that are happening in the press, and in particular how Israel is being presented in a very negative light, partly due to a tremendous PR program put together by the Palestinians and the PLO. Before we get started, I just want to introduce our guests who have come to us with a tremendous amount of expertise in the area. First, we have Ms. Susan Davis-Stemp. It's a pleasure to have you with us. Ms. Stemp is with MediaMonitor.org, which anybody's welcome to, of course, look up after the show. And we'll hear more about that as well. And we also have with us Mr. Samuel Bond, who is a media advisor for Israeli Matters for the BJE, for Board of Jewish Education. Mr. Bond, we're happy to have you with us also.
Nice to be here.
We look forward to hearing from both of you. I want to start off, because this area of discussion might be something new to many of our viewers, as far as how do we make the case about the fact that there is this type of slanted reporting. And do you think, Susan, that most Americans are even aware that there is a problem out there? Or I would say most people probably just take the news media on face value and don't even think to suppose that there could be a problem as far as misrepresentation.
I agree. I think the average American consumer is completely unaware of just how inaccurate and how much distortion there is in the media. And I don't pretend to say that it's only about Israel. I'm sure it goes on all over about various issues. Because I'm well versed in what the truth of the situation is in Israel, that is what allows me it opens my eyes and to what types of distortions there are and how many forms it can take. And
what do you do in MediaMonitor.org? You try to teach people as to
educate the public, exactly, about the various forms. First of all, what is the role and responsibility of journalists and reporters
in general?
And what are the various forms of bias and distortions that go on? What flavors do they come in?
Right.
And this helps not just adults. We aim towards middle school children and up to be more sophisticated consumers of news, to evaluate and process, filter what they're hearing.
All right, because just like in the consumer in anything, as our good old friend Cy Simmons says, the best customer is an educated consumer. So in this case also we had to be educated consumers. Sam, I know that you've done a lot of research, especially on the New York Times, and you've really spent a lot of the last 10 years looking into this issue because it has been such an important issue in the press, and you've developed a reputation for this. Can you give us a little bit of an insight into making the case to our viewers of how do they accept this reality, or this accusation, if you want to call it that the press is really skewing the news a little? How do you present your case?
Well, I think that there have been some books on the matter. The book Bias by Bernard Goldberg which has exposed this in a more generic way, and I think that the Israel reporting is a subset. And we've seen around the country various Jewish communities upset about the way the media has been treating Israel, and the Los Angeles Times has been subject to a boycott, the New York Times has been subject to a boycott.
What is your feeling about these boycotts? I've heard about them. Do you think they're effective or they're counterproductive?
I think that boycotts tend to distance readers from the journalists, and I think that engagement is the most important thing for a reader to do if he's upset with journalism, is to engage the journalists.
And that's, I suppose, part of your role is to be an engager, to try to engage the media or talk to the media and to try to educate them as to a different perspective than they might have had. Because, you know, you think about it, being a journalist is a job. And some of these people come with experience, some without experience. They're given an assignment. They're told, listen, go off and do this story or do a local story. Go fly off to Jerusalem and do a story there.
And they have limited time, limited energy, just
and
like
limited
the rest
education.
of us.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
It's a job like every other job, and in that sense, you know, unless a person would go through a crash course, and they don't have a year to do a study program about Middle Eastern history. So there's a real challenge there for the journalist himself to make sure that he's living up to historical facts without just writing off a story in order to get to tomorrow's deadline. So Sam, if you could, give us some examples so we can just jump right in and get an idea of what some of these problems that we face are. What kind of articles would I read in the Times, let's say? And of course we can extrapolate for any other paper, news magazines, for CNN or radio shows that should jump out at me, that I should start to perhaps take notice of, that, hey, wait a second, there's something about this that just doesn't smell good. So can you give us a couple examples?
I think that's a very good way of looking at it, the smell test. And if you,
okay.
if you look at a TV program or read a paper and it doesn't feel right, then you should begin to question. It's called critical analysis, and I teach this in schools,
Fine.
how to critically analyze the media. So
okay, come on, give us a...
For an example would be an article from the New York Times where they had two pictures.
Yes.
It has to do with the conflict there. And one picture's of a Palestinian funeral and another picture's of an Israeli tank. So the implication is that the Israelis, through their tank, have killed the Palestinians who are being shown in the funeral. But that's not what the article is about.
What's the article about?
The article is about a clash that took place, but the picture is giving a story that's completely separate.
Especially
now,
such large pictures.
Yes,
such large pictures.
absolutely. A large picture
and
a large picture of the funeral. And one of the important things to notice when you're watching the, looking at the media, is the faces. You see the humanity of the people in the picture. And there's another picture of an Israeli funeral, which I don't have right here to show you, but the settlers all have their backs towards the camera. So you don't see the humanity. Here, in this picture, you saw the humanity.
And the anger.
And you saw the tank. Mm-hmm. And the message is very clear.
Well, the mind makes automatic relationships between the pictures and it takes that as the major message.
Right.
Not everybody stops to read the article. A lot of people just look through for the pictures.
Most people see the pictures and the headlines.
Right.
And so the verbiage of the headlines and the import of the pictures is crucial. It trumps the text of the article.
Right.
And here's an example of some of the headline text.
Okay.
In this case, bomb kills at least 19 in Israel.
As Arabs meet over peace.
As opposed to Israelis kill 8 Palestinians.
Mm-hmm.
So on the one hand, you know who the killers are, the Israelis.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, it's a bomb who kills, and we don't know exactly who it is, but
right.
at least 19 in Israel. So on the one hand, you have the active voice, and you have the Israelis doing the killing of Palestinians when the Israelis are doing the violence, but here it's a bomb. It's as if Lincoln, if we were reporting about Lincoln today, we might say, instead of John Wilkes Booth killed Lincoln, we might say gun kills Lincoln.
Mm-hmm.
Because the
It
balance,
detaches it from the
balance of this would be
perpetrator.
Palestinians kill Israelis, and you rarely see that in the headlines.
Mm-hmm.
So this is an example of headline verbiage.
So just the choice of words has a tremendous effect.
Choice of words makes a big difference.
Okay, Susan, can you give us a couple examples also?
Sure. I just wanted to, we like to classify the types of media bias. I would put that the bomb kills, at least 19, into the category of neutralizing words. They neutralize it. It's nobody in particular. Bomb kills. And that should be a flag for people when they read that there's something not okay going on. Many forms of media bias are so insidious. I think the worst is lies of omission, where what's not there, you wouldn't think to question.
Right.
So that's perhaps the most insidious type. But, and we have examples of that too. But, for example, the Boston Globe had done a story about Harvard University, the drive for divestiture.
Yes.
That a petition was signed by some 436 professors. And what they left out, what they neglected to say, was that a counter petition also circulated where 6,000 signatures were gained, and that's
that wasn't newsworthy.
But that's a rather important
Yes.
piece of information that certainly tempers the whole understanding.
So that would be the lies of omission.
That's a lie of omission.
Okay.
On the other hand, we have lies of inclusion, or lies of juxtaposition. And I brought an example of this. There was a story about a gunman in Lebanon.
Yes.
And it circulated on Associated Press. I pulled it off the internet. Tiny little story. I'm gonna read it.
Okay.
Beirut, Lebanon. A man opened fire Wednesday on a Beirut University campus, killing 8 people before he was apprehended by police. Police said the gunman, identified as Ahmed Mansour, began firing in the air and then turned his gun on people in the offices of the Teachers' Compensation Fund in the Literature Department of Lebanese University. It was not immediately known whether Mansour was a student, a teacher, or an employee, or what his motives were. That's basically the story, but it adds now a paragraph. Lebanon was torn apart by fighting during its 1973 through 1990 civil war, and violence continued along its border with Israel until Israeli troops withdrew in 2000 from a zone they had been occupying in the south.
This is an AP release.
Associated Press.
What does one have to do with the other?
So we have no idea why this gunman killed anybody, but here's a thought. They stick in this paragraph.
Blame it on Israel.
Blame it on Israel and what? The occupation.
Right.
So
just that term occupation itself. The term occupation is a very, very vile term from an Israeli perspective, because in any situation throughout history, whenever there has been a war, we consider that the person who won the war is the winner of the war. We don't consider America to be the occupier of Indian country. It just goes on and on and on as far as these types of words that are used in order to build up certain contexts in our mind.
Occupying is a hostile word. What's interesting about this article is that there is an occupier. Israel was not an occupier in Lebanon. They were there in a defensive mode because the government of Lebanon would not protect Israel's northern border, and Israel stepped in to protect its border. That wasn't occupation. But there is an occupying power in Lebanon today, and that's Syria, with 25,000 troops, and they control the Lebanese government. And they're not called the occupier in Lebanon, but Israel is. So I think that your point is very well taken. And the word occupying in Israel is used to justify Palestinian violence. Palestinians say, well, what do you expect? We're an occupied people, and our only recourse is violence. So that word is crucial, because if Israel is not occupying the Palestinians, then they have no justification. And there's a real question as to whether there is an occupation. Oslo Treaty gave governance to the Palestinians. So Israel is not occupying them from the governance point of view.
Right. Now, what I'd like to do also is, Susan, you've made a list here of some very interesting types of distortion, the forms of media distortion. We have that up on the screen if we can get that also, and we can go through these in order to be able to get a picture of some of these. If you can go into these in a little more detail also, in order to be able to give us an idea of exactly what you mean by these. I see you have about 10 or so listed, which are very interesting, and we can take a look in order to be able to go through them. So, of course, lies of omission, you just mentioned one in particular, which is very powerful. Lies of inclusion, Let me just read through them quickly, and then maybe you can pick a couple of them in order to be able to elaborate. So you have imbalanced coverage, we have selective slanted reporting, sensationalist reporting, staged pictures, incendiary reporting, false symmetries or moral equivalency, which is a well-known problem that we've faced in the past concerning equivocating the victims of suicide bombings with the perpetrators, invoking sympathy, outright lies, presenting opinion as news, editorializing pictures, double standards. This really goes on and on and on. It's incredible. You know, if you stop and think about every single one of these things, you could really make yourself crazy reading the newspaper every day.
Right.
Departures from profession. You do. Right. You spend a day. Call your husband. Did you see today's paper? I couldn't believe I didn't get past page 2. It's already 10 o'clock in the morning. Departures from professional journalistic code of ethics, neutralizing words and incriminating words.
Right.
So that's quite a list.
We've already touched on a number of them. We can knock them right off.
Yes, please give me a couple more specifics.
The incriminating words you just mentioned, occupying occupiers and illegal settlements, for example. It's the trial is without trial. You're incriminated without the trial.
Right.
This example with the gunman, as Sam pointed out, is also an example of selective slanted reporting, because it neglects to mention who the true occupier is.
Right.
So it is not only a lie of inclusion, it's a selective slanted reporting. Let's look at some others. Staged pictures. We had the fake funeral in Jenin, which was...
Yeah, was that incredible?
It was carried on Alan Keyes. It was carried on the Sean Hannity show. Yes, that
Just to remind our audience, that was after, quote-unquote, the massacre of Jenin, when they went in order to be able to clean out all the terrorist activity there. The only defense that the Palestinian Liberation Organization had at the time was that there had been this great massacre that took place, and that way they were trying to turn the attention of the world onto the sins of the Israelis, which is a constant thing that we see going on. And the Palestinians have mastered this thing in the press of constantly turning the attention on the Israelis. Can you comment on that? Because it's something that's very disturbing to me personally, how it seems that with every single event, whatever they do, they're programmed to be able to just focus on the Israelis. Do they go through some type of training course to know how to just veer everything against the Israelis?
Well, they do. They very specifically, this has gone on since 1984. It was started, the Palestinian Press Services, by Ramanda Tawil, who later went on to become the mother-in-law of Yasser Arafat, about 6 years later. But she formed the Palestinian Press Services that was dedicated to providing assistance to journalists working in Palestine. And they then joined forces.
It was actually a training program.
Yes, together with the Palestinian Human Rights Information Center, joined forces, and you'll notice the term, even the terminology there is brilliant. Human Rights Information Center, it's a very neutral, it's a very good, it brings associations of benevolence. And they joined forces and created courses to teach all their students that whenever they had an interview with the media, and as you know, not anybody can be interviewed by the media.
Right.
The
Palestinians
control very closely who are the spokesmen. Not anybody like it is in Israel. Anybody and everybody can and does speak their mind. That's not the case in the Palestinian territories. But they were directed, the students were directed to direct the conversation, no matter what the question, to 4 themes, which was Israeli occupation, illegal settlements, human rights abuses, and the right of Palestinians to return to their home. And the constant harping on these themes over the past 20 years has really painted Israel into a box. And it's been very, very effective. It's been a wonderful technique for them.
And the fact is that the attempt has been to make Israel look like the Goliath and the Palestinians look like the David, when in fact anybody who's aware of the situation in the Middle East takes one look at the map and is able to clearly see that Israel in fact is this little speck of land compared to all of the Arab lands together. And the Arab population also is just totally outnumbers and overshadows the 5 million Jews that are living in Israel. So people lose sight of the true perspectives here of exactly what's going on. You're talking about a small, very vulnerable nation that, true, has a strong force, but it's so concentrated in one little area, it's a very sensitive situation.
When the camera focuses in, then you see Israel as the Goliath and the Palestinians as the David. If the camera pulled back, you'd see the Arab world, which is hundreds times larger than Israel in land and population, and you'd see a tiny Israel, so they would be the Goliath. So it's a question of where the camera focuses. And some of the issue has to do with how good a job the Palestinians are doing, and the other half of that is what kind of a job we're doing, and whether we are, as we talked about before, engaging the media, or we're passive about what's taking place. And the engaging of the media would permit us to respond to the kinds of things that take place every day, because you can't just engage a journalist with a general criticism. They won't accept it. But you have to be specific in your comments when you write or call them. Mm-hmm. And for example, there was an article about the Israeli incursion into Gaza this last week, and the headline was in the Times was Israeli military kills 13 in raid on Gaza town, and it was very harsh on Israel in terms of the number of dead and the civilians that were dead, and it wasn't until the 18th paragraph that the Israeli spokesman had a chance to say something. They were silenced for 18 paragraphs, really? And so there were not two sides. So this is something that when people, if you're reading it and you're engaging the media, you can respond to it. Mm-hmm. If you're off boycotting or you're turned away, you can't do anything about it. And if the Palestinians are doing a good job with what they're doing, then it calls on the other communities to do a good job. The incursion into Jenin was a very similar situation a few months ago, where there was an abundance of coverage, hostile coverage about what Israel was doing, that Sharon was flaunting the President of the United States. And in the New York Times, when the President at last praised Sharon as a man of peace, this was buried in a story that it should have been the headline, because Sharon had taken such abuse for so long on this issue.
Right.
So these are things that we have to watch, and there's no substitute for that.
Now, let me ask you a question also. We're working on the assumption then that for most of the media, this is not a matter of bias against Israel. It's a matter of lack of education. In other words, hopefully we're not talking about any ill intent being here, even though there are certain channels like CNN or NPR or the Times perhaps that have been more the target. But even with those, are we working on the assumption that it's more lack of education than actual bias?
I would say so. I would say so, yes.
So it's not as if anything's coming from the top down, that this is our perspective towards Israel, and I want the reports to be reflective of our editorial position.
Well, Israel is put in the position of being the Goliath against the David. Israel is the Western developed country against the third world Palestinians, and so to the extent that the media takes the position of the underdog, which it does in many situations, not just in Israel, in this country particularly, in many areas, then Israel is going to be tarred by that same brush. And as long as the Palestinians can portray themselves as the victims, they're going to get better coverage. And so what's really going on in the Palestinian Authority, in the areas of the brainwashing of children on TV, needs to be exposed so that the Palestinians are not able to portray themselves as the victims that they're not. Yeah. They're really not the victims in this situation.
Speaking of that also, I think we have a clip also talking about some of the Palestinian children. Maybe we can just take out a minute just to see that, because these are the types of things that are not shown that really should be shown, because the it gives us an example of how the American public is not really being given the full picture of what is going on in the Palestinian world. Can we get that clip now?
And do not cry over my parting. Oh, my dear father, for my country, martyrdom. Do not be sad, my dear, and do not cry over my parting. Oh, my dear father, for my country, I shall sacrifice myself. With determination and desire, I long to approach. How sweet is martyrdom when I embrace you, O my land. My beloved, O my mother, my most dear, be joyous over my blood and do not cry for me.
The Palestinians, having encouraged their children to die, use the pictures of the dead children as their international
of course,
public...
is a terrible type of thing. You'd put that on American television and news, and people would go crazy to hear something like that, but it just isn't there. It's like your lies of omission.
And it also fits into the category of double standards, because if, I mean, some of this has made its way into the news, but if this type of child abuse went on American shores, even on European shores, people would be screaming bloody murder, and it is allowed to go on without challenge.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. Well, this is quite a challenge that you've taken upon yourself, and I want to thank you both for taking the challenge on and making it part of your service to God and country, and of course to help bring truth to the eyes and the ears of many Americans. If anybody has any questions, I know they can just contact Susan at, I believe it's S. Davis at media-monitor.org.
Yes,
right, don't forget the dash. And in order to be able to have a better idea of what's going on, of course, you can look up at MediaMonitor.org at any time in order to be able to get some more idea. There are many other organizations, as you mentioned, Camera. There's also Media Watch, I believe. Unbelievable amount of organizations that have sprung up because of this problem. This is not a problem that has just been made up by our two guests. This is a problem that there are hundreds of people watching out for and who are very aware that there are some serious misperceptions that are being put across by the press. And just some of the headline writers. You know, headline writers are people of jobs. They just quickly write a headline. They look through an article probably very quickly, and they're totally insensitive to what these headlines are doing because they just have to fit into a certain amount of space, and they just have to make sure it's going to catch people's attention. So they're into doing it with a little flair, because that's why they get paid. But in the meantime, obviously it creates some tremendous problems. So I want to thank you again for being with us.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
And please, when you read the paper, when you listen to the radio, when you do anything involving the media, realize that these are human beings who perhaps do not have the total picture. Go on and read some books. Go on and get yourself a good education. Find out what the Israeli cause is all about, what the Palestinian cause is all about. Find out the history of really what is happening, why Israel is struggling for a survival that is so important for all of us, all of humanity. And in the meantime, we'll see you next week, same time, same station, at the Jewish Spotlight. Shalom.
Moshiach,